realistic, I guess, is alignment on AI governance across countries with, fair to say, very different strategic interests right now. And where do you see maybe, multilateral institutions? I know multilateralism is not a very popular theme these days, but where do you see multilateral institutions or maybe other international players playing a role in this space? So over to you.
Thank you, Sabina. Thanks to my fellow speakers. It's great to be here today, really keeping the energy up on the final day of the summit. We can all do it. Let me answer your question directly and then perhaps elaborate a little bit more in detail. Global consensus on how to govern AI is a no-go. It is not going to happen in this geopolitical environment. However, partial alignment on priority issue areas is possible, and it's pragmatic to throw our weight behind these smaller gatherings that we can then scale using the multilateral format. Now let's take a second to sketch out the state of play, and I know that we have some great experts in the room on the panel, so I won't spend too long doing this. We have been absolutely covered in really optimistic summit rhetoric, walking into Bharat Mandapam, going to side events over the course of this week. But despite the optimism, outside of these walls in the background, the US-China AI race continues to accelerate to the umpteenth degree. The capabilities of advanced and the most frontier AI systems and models, the little we know about their capabilities, mined with huge gaps in transparency, continue to advance. And global scientists only recently have issued warnings about the state of the science and the intense uncertainty surrounding these capabilities and the impact they might be having on our communities and societies. Well, it's a good thing we have strong international institutions and shared values. We don't. It's a really difficult time for global cooperation outside of AI. We're seeing, I would argue, since the Second World War, an unprecedented degradation of the international organizations, the shared values, the rule of law that we have all held so dearly. So, suffice to say, it's a difficult time for global governance. It's a difficult time for the global governance of AI. Now, institutions in the past have very much been brokers, mediators, and scalers of consensus on tricky governance issues. And some of the governance problems we're facing today are pretty old, right? I've encountered them in previous roles at Chatham House and other areas of tech. I'm sure the experts on our panel have come across them. And the core governance puzzle that we need to figure out is this: taking into account the state of geopolitics, the uncertainty around the state of the science, the market dynamics mediated by these leading labs and, intensely competitive US and Chinese AI race dynamics. How on earth do we bring rivals and competitors around the same table? How do we bring states with a nominal or a minimal alignment of interests and incentives into the same room? Now, you started by asking me about multilateralism and institutions, but maybe let's reframe this and talk about coalitions. In other areas of governance, what we've seen is intense coalition building in crisis or unstable settings around a trusted mechanism, a trusted approach, perhaps in the absence of shared values and principles. And what I'm really interested in the context of AI, is where coalition building can develop trust around a credible governance approach, adopt a state champion, get support from associations, from builders, from leading labs themselves, and then scale it using the multilateral format. And over the past few days, I've been really excited by some of this splintering to scale dynamics that I've seen maybe in conversations on verification, on-chip hardware, risk mitigation strategies, even anonymized collection of usage data, which came out of the commitments yesterday. Now, what's the messaging that can drive this coalition building in the absence of trusted institutions, in the absence of shared values? I'll get into this later in my remarks, but I think it has to be sovereignty and strategic autonomy. Resource-constrained countries who might decide to adopt a common data governance approach, who might decide to pool resources like compute, have to also consider a degree of governance alignment, again, at this low-hanging fruit, in order to not only withstand the dynamics of the AI race, but to ensure that the collective benefits of cooperation and governance alignment massively outweigh anything they could do individually. So I think I'll leave it there. Slightly pessimistic take. Let's see if there's some more optimism on the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Bella. I don't think it was that pessimistic. You did kind of. I think you made it sound very pragmatic in terms of, look, the world is not what we want it to be, and there isn't the level of multilateral cooperation that we maybe used to have. But you have talked about coalition building, and it's probably the best we can hope for in the world as it is, as opposed to the world as we'd like it right now. And Rajesh, can I turn to you next? For emerging economy, obviously access to compute, data, and infrastructure are critical. But what do you see of some of the maybe the barriers most pressing, but also maybe opportunities for AI adoption in India and beyond? So over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me in the panel. Pleased to be with all of you, and then there's a few of you who showed up here as well. So thank you for coming up. We wish this was the Modi inauguration last evening, where we had a little bit more than this crowd, but nevertheless we'll do with this. But I believe we used to talk about digital divide for a long period of time, and I think while that had its own puts and takes, when you compare a smaller economy and smaller country with the larger one and so on, I think the AI divide is going to be much bigger than the digital divide which we saw, because the biggest difference is that at least that in the digital divide, it's about access and so on, whereas this is all about agency, and then it can completely put you at a different back foot. So it is such an important topic to talk about when you talk about the broader haves and have-nots, and what really goes on with the larger smaller economies and so on. And I truly believe that the accessibility, when you look at the broader scales, it will come across multiple things, starting with compute, one of the largest piece of what we are talking about here, right? I think Isabella, you mentioned in terms of the race between the US and China and so on and so forth. But if you leave those two countries, then of course we have a big drop in terms of where the real access is going to be. And I believe totally that the continued limited access to the broader compute facility is going to be unduly putting some of these smaller countries, especially the developing ones, into a little bit of a disadvantage. So I think there's a lot that can be done around it in terms of saying, what is that countries can potentially do in terms of pooling and so on. But I think there is certainly an issue when it comes to compute. And not just in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of expense and so on. Because at the end of the day, all of these are even if you use the purchasing power parity and then sort of look at what it costs for people to sort of get into the kind of level of GPUs potentially, or GPU clusters one has to produce to even have a meaningful language model and so on. I think that's going to be a very different ball game. And the second element of this whole broader issue that we're talking about is also the data, and then the organization of data, availability of data, quality of data, and so on. I think the more you get into the developed world, you will find, or developing world, you will find that the data itself is very siloed in many ways. There are different state silos, different department silos, and so on. And it gets into a point where the data, which is such an important and integral part of everything to do with AI, you will end up having the data which gets fed into the broader models, and eventually the AI systems will necessarily not have the right representation of that population, which is a huge concern. I mean especially when you, of course, India is slightly luckier in many ways in terms of us, playing that game a little bit, punching a little bit above our weight in some sense. But when you go down on the list of countries which do not have access to all of these, I think you're going to find it even harder in terms of solving the data issue, the data availability, data data quality, all of this becomes a bigger issue. And then when we talked about the infrastructure gap, the compute gap, it's a little bit more than just the pure compute itself, the GPUs and so on, but it's also about connectivity, power. These are the issues which we somehow take it for granted in other segments, but I think you will find that power is going to be a huge foundation for all of that. And as you know, that there are multiple layers in building any of the AI systems, and one of the bottommost layer is going to be power. And then what really happens to the power, and if it has to be clean power, then does it put additional tax on the developing world for making sure that power comes out clean? Connectivity is a huge issue, even though it's kind of broadly solved in some sense with all the satellite options and so on. But we continue to have the kind of connectivity you need to run a truly inclusive AI system is going to be very different from those people have thought otherwise. And then of course we can go on and on in terms of the other layers of skills will become a huge issue. The availability of skills and ensuring that you have the right skills, not just to leverage AI but also to build AI. I mean, there are two different type of capabilities that you need to produce in any country. So these are the issues, and how do you make sure that you have a broader the opportunity itself would be to sort of look at this and say, are there other ways of collaborating, other ways of partnering and so on? Because these especially when you go down the line list of countries, we have close to 200 countries or so in the world, and when you leave the top 5 or 10 and then you go below and then you keep going down the list, it becomes harder. I mean, I don't think that everybody is going to be producing a full-blown large language model and things that they need to sort of do it for themselves. And at that point in time, the question will be, can you really partner? Can you really leverage some of the common systems that can be done across these countries and so on?
Thank you. I mean, you've done a brilliant job at putting all the free problems we've got, and then saying you've got a long list afterwards in terms of cooperation. But I love the touch of optimism there at the end. It's like, if you leave 2 countries out of the room, you still have 100 and whatever 85 that need to figure it out. So I liked a lot that framing, and thanks for touching on the infrastructure. I think we tend to talk a lot about data and semiconductors and all the cool stuff, and we forget about like the tissue that actually holds it all together. So really great contribution. And talking about data access and access to compute, I'm going to turn to Rafi, because and I'm hoping you're coming in with the hope after the doom and gloom of not multilateral cooperation. So from a technical and open ecosystem perspective, how does access to compute and the high quality data that Rajesh was talking about shape who gets to build AI? And what design choices or collaborative models could help lower barriers, obviously without compromising trust and security that makes the technology work to start with. So over to you.
I mean, unsurprisingly, being someone from Mozilla, I'll probably go with the open source angle as one of the opportunities to actually align the talent, align the capabilities, and actually do shared infrastructure. I mean, maybe I'll draw 2 analogies to think about, and then we can go more deep into those as it applies to AI. But for all practical purposes, every computer on the planet runs Linux. There are a few iPhones here and there on top of it. But the Linux model, I think, is a good one for all of us to think about. That like every country, every nation in the world, almost every company in the world contributes to this single code base, which is then deployed across these billions of computers, every computer on the planet. And there are lots of derivative work that happens from it. So like a company, I think, is a good one for all of us to think about. That like the Linux model, I think, is a good one for every nation about. That like every country contributes to a single code base, which is then deployed. So I think there's contributes to the series of being able to share there's all sorts of derivative collaborative. And there's a lot of Linux, I think, is a good one for all of us to think about. That like every country, every nation in the world contributes to original
because
web,
it's moving so
you needed
fast,
to ask for permission
there's
in order to
always
deploy a
going to be a
website.
lag
And
between
by
even,
permission,
like,
I mean
the
effectively
scientific
you had
papers
to
take
go
time
buy
to be
yourself
written.
a Solaris box. You had to
If
buy
there
yourself
are
a Windows
studies-
NT server. You're trying to configure an active.
The U.S. administration or other government colleagues that you've heard from on these issues and how it's helpful to provide that information?
Yeah, absolutely. So at KCR, our focus right now is truly on unlocking innovation and adoption. And we work in the standards space, and so we look to how NIST fostered standards and best practices and guidelines documents can help with that innovation and that adoption. And so the NIST process, the way it normally works is we like to gather and convene industry to understand the challenges they're facing. It's more of a bottom-up grassroots approach than a top-down. We're not sitting there in Washington and saying, you know, this is the problem and we're going to fix it. We take a little bit of humility and say, we don't actually know what the problem is until we talk to the people who are closest to the issue, because we only have a narrow slice of the world from our vantage point, and the people who are actually in the field working on innovation, working on adoption, they have a better sense of what the barriers are. And so we encourage everyone in industry and across the ecosystem to really engage with us, to tell us the problems that you're encountering, and we have structured formal ways for you to do that. For instance, the request for information on AI agent security, I think it's open for about another month, and some have already submitted comments, but we
So think about studies that involve people, you know, that they're going to take months. And so by the time we start seeing clues that there's a potential problem, so you can think of something recent that was not expected, that like the psychological effects on people of these chatbots. We now have lots of anecdotal evidence, and we're only starting to see the scientific studies. And of course, on the policy side, it's going to be even later, because those discussions are going to happen after we see stronger scientific evidence. So there is going to be a lag, and that's a real problem, because things could move too fast for policy to catch up.
So maybe that leads well into our next question. We often hear that AI governance is moving too slowly. And from your experience, like what kinds of scientific assessments or benchmarks could realistically keep pace with this rapid change?
Yeah, that's a great question. My opinion on this is that we should be thinking about not just policy in the usual sense of like coming up with principles, but we should try to strive for high-level principles that can be applied without having to go into the details, because the details are going to change. And the second thing is, I think we should strive for technology that are going to help to implement those guardrails in the field, in the deployment of AI, because otherwise there's not enough time to react.
Well, thank you for those insights. And also congratulations on your recent appointment to the Independent International Scientific Panel on AI. In a few words, how do you see this new panel helping to strengthen the link between science and global AI policymaking?
Well, I think there's something really important about this panel, and its global aspect and being rooted in the UN. And the reason I'm saying this is that AI is going to be transforming our world very clearly, and it's going to have global effects, whether it is on the good side, the benefits, or on the risks, but also the kind of power relationships that are going to be changing in the future. And I'm personally very concerned about how this will unfold for developing countries in the global south. And we need to work in a multidisciplinary way so that we can foresee those effects, and we can start discussions to make sure that everyone is at the table and no one is on the menu.
Well, well said, Professor Benjo. Well, thank you very much for kickstarting our discussion. We will now turn to our panel.
So we have to make sure that these software-defined systems, just imagine an airplane, right? You know what has happened in
So, ladies and gentlemen, it is essential that discussions about AI policy include the voices of key industry actors. And I am pleased to invite Mr. Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President, Microsoft Corporation, for his keynote address.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My apologies for being a few minutes late. I want to offer a couple of thoughts this morning. The first, back to the bursting of the tulip bubble in the Netherlands hundreds of years ago. I think there is a corollary worth thinking about. Just as there is a risk that humanity forgets the mistakes it made 80 years ago, humanity runs the risk of forgetting the great successes it created 80 years ago. It was just over 80 years ago that the world came together to create the United Nations. It was, in my opinion, one of humanity's greatest accomplishments of the 20th century. It is a unique organization in a very imperfect world. And so, of course, on any day in any year, it is possible for anyone to blame the United Nations for the imperfections that we see all around us. But the truth is this: those imperfections are fewer and their consequences are less disastrous, in my view, because of the United Nations. And one of the great things Microsoft in a job like mine is that I get to work in a global organization. We have subsidiaries in 120 countries. We do work in 190 countries. We see the world. It turns out that everywhere we go, we see the United Nations. Sometimes it's the United Nations Development Program working to foster economic development. Sometimes it is UNHCR helping refugees. Sometimes it is the UN Office of Human Rights seeking to protect human rights. But the truth is, if there's a problem, the United Nations is almost always part of the solution. We need to remember this. And we need to remember that however challenging the last 80 years have been, we have managed as humanity, as a species, to live with the ever-constant presence of nuclear weapons without using them or destroying ourselves. The United Nations has, in fact, in my view, been indispensable to not just the protection of people, but the preservation of our species. Why does that matter now? Why should we talk about it today and this week in Delhi? Because here we are on the cusp of the future. A technology that we all know will likely change the future. Here we are in the second month of the second quarter of the 21st century, and we need to focus on how we bring the institutions on which we rely into that future. So then let me talk about a second aspect that I think is so important to think about this morning. One of the things I'm constantly struck by leading a global organization is how often everyone disagrees with each other about almost everything. But one of the things I've learned along the way is that I think one of the reasons people so quickly disagree is that we rush so quickly to debate competing solutions. This happens in domestic politics, it happens in international diplomacy, and frankly, happens in a global company. It actually happens everywhere, even in families. As soon as there's a problem, people want to talk about the solution. And then people have different solutions, and then they debate, and they disagree, and they argue, and sometimes it's even worse than that. One of the things I've learned is the reason people so often disagree about the solution is they don't have a common understanding of the problem. They don't spend enough time talking about the problem. They don't have a shared contextual understanding of the problem they're trying to solve. They're too quick to want to blame someone for the problem, and then that spirals into a discussion that becomes completely unconstructive. Why does that matter today? Because what we're here to talk about today is all about creating a more common understanding together based on science of where artificial intelligence is going. This is an indispensable tool. Indeed, it's a critical service for humanity. So we can all learn together. We can all think together. We can all understand together. I think it's especially critical, to be honest, when it comes to artificial intelligence. I think it's especially critical when it comes to artificial intelligence. Even because most of the conversation, I would argue that it has two. I would argue that it has two. I would argue that it has two. Is it first very involved in the prediction? You know what? I've worked in the tech sector. You know what? I've worked in the tech sector. Listen, my whether they were right or wrong. I used the researcher agent in Microsoft Copilot a couple weekends ago, and I loaded a lot of names. I won't say whom, but you can guess. Predictions they made about all the technologies. Look at the predictions they made about when these technologies the average grade was 25%. Get close to the top of. You were at the bottom. So let's just understand one thing. There is no such thing as a crystal ball. No one has one. But what we do have, is the ability to understand. Where we are. And what we do have, is a better understanding. To appreciate what is happening each and every. There's a second flaw. In many of the conversations that take place in this AI summit. Everybody wants to talk about how they're going to make machines more. That's interesting. I think it's interesting to imagine a world where a data center is like a country of genius. As I mentioned yesterday, who lived in the Bronze Age, geniuses already. What that should remind us, human is that ability is neither fixed. And so what really matters is not whether we are going to build machines that are smarter than humans. Yes, we will. But how will we use those machines to make people to help us to do what we need. That is what this effort is all about. Harness the power of science to build a common understanding of what is changing, and then let's connect it with the global dialogue on so we can pursue that will ensure that this technology serves. There's no better place to get started than here. There's no better time than now. And there is no better institution on the planet to preserve humanity and protect the United Nations. And on behalf of Microsoft, I just want you to know, we are putting our full energy into everything that we can to do everything that we can. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's just understand one thing together. There is no such thing as a crystal ball. In a world.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for those insights on accountability and the role of industry. We now turn to our panel. Our panel brings together scientific leadership, public policy expertise, and international coordination. Please welcome to the stage our speakers. To the stage our speaker Balaraman Ravindran, IIT Madras, Swaminathan Samar, Chief Scientist, WHO, Ajay Kumar Su, Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, and Francis Special Envoy for AI. Also pleased to introduce our moderator Gil, Undersecretary General and Undersecretary General and Special Envoy for Digital and Emerging Technologies. I invite him to guide the discussion.
Thank you very much.
So we can that will ensure that this technology there's no better place to get started than here. There's no better time than now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anil, for leading us and not read his book, Elegant Math Behind Machine Learning. Have a go at it.
Of Agentic AI. What should the big question now is what are our goal in the tech industry obviously is to ensure that policymakers look at our goal in the tech industry obviously is inspirational to innovators. That it doesn't interfere with the ability of innovators inspirational to innovators out to market. It doesn't interfere with the ability of innovators to benefit the products and services out to market. Policymakers that we all want to see and benefit from. But of course, policymakers have other things in mind. They want to make sure that the design of products that are deployed into the market and security. So we have a great industry panel of experts who are going to share their views on what policymakers should be thinking about who are going to share what they should be doing on what policymakers should be thinking about Agentic AI and what they should be doing to inspire the use of Agentic AI.
Possible, but I think like architecturally it actually is in a bunch of different ways. So I love the indigenous data model, like looking at what different indigenous peoples have done around data collectives for their local areas. So there's a group of people, for example, in Hawaii that is doing this for their genomic data, because genomic data is really useful for pharmaceutical models. And so like they've been looking for ways that they can both monetize but also have the provenance of their data as it goes through these pharmaceutical models. So there are some professors out of UCSD starting to build actually what these data trusts would look like for Hawaiian people. And I think that model could be replicated in lots of different parts of the world. Mozilla is actually attempting to do a bunch of this. So we're creating something that we call the Mozilla Data Collaborative, or Collective, sorry. And what the collective is meant to be is it meant to be a marketplace of ethically sourced but provenance traced data sets so that you could bring your data. We'll actually help you scrub it, clean it, etc. And also make sure you have the appropriate licenses on it so that people can find the data sets that they want to train their models, but make sure that attribution is given, compensation is given, etc. So we're literally in conversations with almost every radio station on the planet to try to get their recordings and their transcripts onto the marketplace, not for Mozilla to make money. In fact, we actually want the radio stations to have a monetization path for all this data that they're sitting on, and not simply have it scraped by big model providers to try to soak that into their system. Instead, require that it be licensed, require that compensation. So I think there are models there. And on the computational side, I think there's also a lot of interesting things showing up around federated learning opportunities. For those of you who don't know what federated learning is, think of, Google did this very famously when they trained their handwriting model across everyone's Android phone. So your handwriting is very personal and private. Your handwriting is on your device. And Google is able to train a handwriting recognition model that didn't require them to get access to your data, because part of the training happened on your phone, and then the model waits for shipped back up for centralized training. And I think something like that actually could be an interesting model for international collaboration of like, I can bring my data to the game, my healthcare data, my values data, my language data, but not have to release it to a different company, or sorry, a different country. Instead, allow you to do some of the training on my compute, on my infrastructure, and only ship model weights back up, and actually then create bigger models across borders and across geographies that could actually take into account different healthcare scenarios, different value systems, etc. in there. So I think that there are these interesting alternative architectures that we can actually start leaning into. These data trust models, these federated learning models that actually could be massive enablers for cooperation and allow us to build these foundational things that we can then fine-tune and bring to our local context.
Thanks so much, Rafi. That fine-tuning seems to be definitely a thing in this conversation, how you kind of build for different cultures and countries. And Halak, maybe I can come to you next, because we keep talking about kind of the international cooperation and coordination, but I'm wondering, how do you translate that, chit-chat into actual skills, capacity, capability for emerging economies? We are in a very international AI Impact Summit. Kind of how do we bring that from, we talk about governance, to all this international policy actually delivering for emerging economies?
It's a good question. I think, let me start out by saying capacity building isn't just, running workshops or basically talking to regulators about, this should be done. What it is capacity building, I think for emerging economies especially, is critical because hold on, let me think. Okay, so emerging economies have unequal access to data, information, and technology, right? So what are we trying to solve for here in terms of capacity building? The first thing I would say is shared evidence. So what we need is we need players to help into this capacity building system with documents, results, performance, benchmarks to lift up other players. That, I think, would be number one. The second thing I think is key and sometimes overlooked is the value of procurement policies. And I agree with Isabella. What if we had an industry coalition, like a cross-border network, where they're solving for procurement policies or procurement rules? And what this does is this brings in global players. So now what you're doing is you're opening up your country to different markets. The next thing I would say is a lot of, let me put it this way. So there are developers who develop the technology, and then there are deployers. They buy the technology and they use it. So for example, like a public sector agency. Why is it so?
To you, Ravi, Professor, thank you very much. I'm going to now as AI policies begin to take shape, and you've been involved in as AI policies begin to take shape, as you've been involved in some regulators of public sector users, your signals urgently guide regulatory AI research practice. So in a sense, the loop coming back, future AI research practice. So in a sense, the loop coming back into research.
Thank you for that question. AI right now, right, especially in the global south. So we don't completely understand right now, especially in the global south, and how is it going to affect the society, the people, livelihood, and everything. In fact, I also feel that we don't have enough evidence about how AI is going to affect. I also feel that we don't have enough evidence about how AI is getting isolated, how children are getting uniform in cities and the cultural So the government, as we heard our Prime Minister says, the government, as we heard our Prime Minister says, what is the evidence? What is happening? What is happening? So we hear stories about So we hear stories about children, all of these stories are coming. All of these stories are coming. So what is it? All of these stories are coming. These kinds of policies that the government says
whatever you think is needed to get to that point where we can actually talk governance meaningfully as a broad international
effectiveness of these areas. What are the evaluate what are the kinds of laws that have laws effectiveness of these, for example, build a what are the kinds of laws that have a co-pilot? These are, for example, these are we have so we have
quickly follow up sustainable development goals. Impact in the quick example. Just a quick example.
So that was not in the notes. That was not in the. That was not. How to think on. How to think on. How to think on. That was not in the notes. How to think on. Let me take one thing. Let me take one thing. Let me take one thing that we are on right now is on. Now is on. Now is on one thing. So, for example, we don't. For example, now is on evidence of AI evidence. So, for example, how likely evidence of AI. So we have done some. We have done some preliminary studies. Author of the series. So we have done some audience, because it's been staged pictures. Author of the series, what we have found out is effectiveness. So what we have found out is the direct function of the students. So the students using AI, then they now I don't know if the students using AI more. I don't know if then they using AI more. Therefore, using AI more. Therefore, so these are questions that we are getting something as something as these are questions that because there is a lot of positive buzz around even there positive buzz around using AI.
Thank you, Ravi, and we honored to have you on the international scientific panel. If I may jump to you, you're an AI scientist. All of us know you as you're an AI scientist. All of us know you have some in Paris. But you're also from your perspective, you live in these scientists. From your perspective, what kind of scientific evidence would take
Thank you for the question. Understanding is first thing. Understanding I make is to make policymakers. I think it's for us things that we don't understand for us as human beings, things that we don't understand. I also scientists understanding things, and then maybe the second understanding is not to give an example of how understanding something in the field of AI and work, we've had in the field of AI and work, we've had AI revolution, but scientists, I believe that
women, for men, for different types of jobs.
I'm going to turn to you. Merci beaucoup. Occupying system science. India has employed some of the science knowledge, and India has employed some of that technology and societal future. India has the AI,
I might actually start making a lot of sense, and that aligned with governance opportunities, philosophical opportunities, makes me very excited. Like MIT, there's an economist, Frank Nagel, has a report recently that approximately $24 billion US dollars are being wasted by not switching to open source models right now. So the economics are starting to make a lot of sense. So I think if once all these stars align, it becomes almost obvious what an answer could look like for local governments around open source AI models, etc. So I'm really excited for that in the next 12
No, I agree with both of what's been said so far, but I also want to give a sense of, I think it's, when you look at AI governance, and people tend to sort of lead with regulation first. I believe that countries, and especially the countries which we talked about in terms of more from an inclusion point of view, you got to lead with innovation first mindset, because I think regulation is required and certainly needed, but I think innovation is probably needed more in some sense. And also when you look at the AI governance across all of that, what we do, while there could be horizontal governance which allows systems, I think the more meaningful governance that you're going to find when you get into sectoral governance, meaning when you look at the AI systems for healthcare, then you'll find that the understanding of a harm in the healthcare segment is very different from financial services and so on. So how do you get into those sectoral areas, and then you can have meaningful governance structure? And last but not least, you need to have the right talent and people who understand all of this, both in public sector and people who are supposedly governing all of this. That is something which is, it's not the talent in terms of broader AI model building and people who are building AI systems, but how do you make sure that the talent in the governance space, in the governments and people who are actually regulating it, they don't understand the real harm, and then it's going to be a bigger issue. And especially when it comes to the list of countries that we talked about always, when you get deeper down the list, you will find that the talent is going to be a huge issue in terms of understanding them.
Thank you. And, as someone who lives in Brussels, I'll make sure to take that message back.
Okay, so what am I most excited about, I guess, in the next 12 months? I mean, in the last few days, you've seen companies really, really excited about AI, but what you've also seen is countries very excited about AI. So what does this mean in governance? It means that the community and the participation is only going to increase. I don't see it going backwards. And so as technology is evolving, more players are going to have a voice in the system, and the standards and the IQ body is a higher body. And I think because of this convergence, we are going to, as a society, just like increase our literacy of not only AI but technology, but also bring it into whatever we're in. If we're in the private sector, if we're in the public sector, and because of that, I think I think a lot of progress.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the panel. Thanks for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
So this is a very important source. Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree.
Thank you. That's a great closing. That's a great, ladies and gentlemen, please join me. Outstanding. We are going to straight to the closing.
Thank you to the panel for discussion. Minister Josephine Teo.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. First allow me to
Easter, what an amazing time of year when we celebrate the most important moment of the entire history of the world. And I should know because I am the host. What was the most important moment of the entire history of the world? Well, it was that God's people waited years and years and years and years. Do you want to hear the story? The amazing, incredible story? God loved us so much that He gave His one and only Son. You do? Well, great, because I'm going to tell you the whole Easter story. I can tell because I know he was born in a barn. Wait. I've already told that story. How about we skip ahead a few years later when Jesus is all grown up doing amazing things all over the place?
Jesus and his disciples went all over Israel, showing everyone what the kingdom of God was like. Do you know how he did that?
That's easy. By teaching them.
Well, yes, but also by doing amazing, unbelievable, incredible, unimaginable things called miracles.
What? Wow! But, what's a miracle?
Jesus is. Let me tell you about 3 of his miracles. One night, Jesus was on a boat with his disciples when...
Oh no! A huge... A huge storm has taken over the sea!
Multiple signs and policies in facilitating overemphasized we must recognize that global AI overemphasized landscape is becoming effort. We must recognize that global AI multiple initiatives, frameworks, and institutions. Increasingly fragmented, there are multiple narratives, lies, and legitimacy, and business to encourage lies across legitimacy and inclusiveness. We therefore welcome the establishment of the Independent International Scientific Panel on building on the work of the UN High-Level Advisory Body on AI, which published its report of governing AI High-Level Advisory Body at the end which published its report. We note that panel's multidisciplinary approach covering we note that social sciences ethics, all of these are necessary to address the complexity of AI governance. All of these are necessary. Finally, I would just like to acknowledge that we now have substantial convergence on high-level AI principles. That we now have substantial convergence on high-level AI principles. The challenge is in operational transparency, accountability, fairness. We need to find standardized evaluation methodologies that work across different regulatory contexts. Standardized evaluation capacity building so that all countries can meaningfully engage with the technical evidence, and not just with the large AI research, with the technical evidence. I would encourage all stakeholders to view scientific input. I would encourage all constraints on policy flexibility, but not as a foundation for more durable, effective governance, as a foundation for public trust, for more durable, we need to keep the conversation going, one where science is government. We need to keep the conversation going, sharp where science of government, and perhaps government by highlighting Singapore's continued commitment to contribute by highlighting discussions of very positive approach to the transatlantic exchange discussion. We were very fortunate to bring about international consensus on AI safety as a priority. Singapore is sensitive to AI safety. We will continue to participate in the joint testing efforts of international. We will continue to participate in the joint evaluation efforts of the international network. Have organized two editions of evaluation AI science.
From wrong to right.
When Paul was in jail as Lord, he had a lot of time on his hands.
Since he couldn't go out and tell people about Jesus, he wrote love